Seeking is an illusion. Anytime we notice ourselves seeking mentally, which means imagining a better future, imagining a more ideal situation, a state of enlightenment, a state of joy or peace, we are noticing the illusory nature of thought, because we're noticing that that thought is pointing to a future that doesn't exist. The way you test that is you look into your experience immediately. Do you find a future? Do you find a past here? Do you find the flow of time when you're not thinking? Without referencing a thought about how something will be later, or how you wish something won't be later, can you find evidence for time? Now, it's very easy to mentally or logically argue that it's absurd to say that time doesn't exist or the past or future doesn't exist. But those arguments exist solely inside of thought. 100%. Because if you just look into your experience, into what you're feeling, hearing, seeing, even the movement of consciousness or the movement of mind, what evidence do you find for anything other than right now? This immediate experience. So the future, the belief in the future, the seeking that comes along with that, and the aversion, which could be described as seeking a condition that you don't want to occur, exist only in the thought world. And seeing that clearly right now, it's unavoidable but to fully recognize that you are completely present right now, or that presence is all there is right here and now. The only way to experience anything other than presence is to experience a thought and then go just a little unconscious to the unavoidable noticing of presence. And so we believe the story we tell ourselves about how I'm going to control the future, how I'm going to change things in the future. In our mind, we do this mentally. We do this automatically. That thought world is the only place we can go to seemingly avoid the knowing of this presence, this unavoidable truth of presence. And even when we're paying attention to thoughts, it's not as if we're not present. Presence doesn't go away. The truth that there is only this eternal moment, that doesn't go away, but it can be obscured in a certain way by an activity of mind, by a reflection. And that reflecting starts at a young age. So the reflection reflects back seemingly inward to a seeming inward space. And from that vantage point in that seeming inward space, we start to feel like a subject. And that subject feels like it's aware of potential objects of choice, futures, agendas, things I need and don't need. And it feels in control when it does that. That sense of the subjective self. It feels in control just until it doesn't. When we see clearly that that feeling of being in control is causally related to the feeling of being out of control, when suddenly that thought world that we've convinced ourselves we live in turns on us. It's not so comfortable. The thoughts are saying things we don't want to hear. Negative self-images, beliefs about failure, I've done something wrong, I'm doing something wrong, struggles with the idea of willpower. All of these lead to a feeling of being out of control. But underlying all of that, the push and pull of the mind, in control, out of control, is a growing sense of separation. That fundamental movement into subjectivity is intrinsically uncomfortable. and we feel it. And the more sensitive we are, the more we feel it. And actually, the more we wake up, the more we notice it. This is why awakening can be uncomfortable for a while, because we can't avoid noticing ways in which we go unconscious voluntarily. But it has to be this way so that we can unwind those dualistic knots, those tendencies to subjectify, to imagine things that aren't true, like the future, the past, control, in a mental way. So as we unwind this, as we become more aware, then we have more of a fidelity with presence, appreciation for presence, a knowing of what it is, and a recognition that we can remain in knowing presence ongoing. And when this happens, we start to refine our understanding experientially of what presence actually is. I have a video on the evolution of the experience of presence in one of the playlists, if you're interested. So what this is about, ultimately, this whole process, is being willing to be completely honest about what's real, verifiable, in evidence right now, and what is a movie playing on the imaginary screen in the mind, and the sense of the subject aware of that movie playing on the screen, and the associated distorted feelings and beliefs that arise with that sense of subject, like control in the mental realm, like solidity, like predictability. These qualities or beliefs feel good in the realm of the subjective mind, the subjective self, some of the time. In that world where we've already made some erroneous preconceptions, it makes sense to imagine ourselves in control, believe ourselves into a better future, even to believe we have qualities we don't possess, or that we don't have qualities that we do possess. This is the nature of unconsciousness, not seeing things just as they are. Enlightenment could be described as seeing things just as they are, not adding or subtracting, not distorting it or filtering it through what we think is good for us or what we think we need to feel satisfied. Enlightenment isn't about being satisfied. It's not about being anything. It's about seeing that to live with agendas, with the illusion of control, constantly pushing and pulling on life, leads to suffering. The sense of being separate from everything is inherently uncomfortable. The sense of being in control in our minds, when in the external world it's clear that we're not in control of all the things we wish we were in control of, is inherently uncomfortable. So a lot of this movement of awakening is just simply seeing what is not true and seeing that it's all thought-based. Once we recognize that, it's really a wonderful recognition, because now we can immediately attune our attention to what is not a thought. What isn't a thought? Whatever's not a thought. Whatever you can't think about, speak about. Structure and language. The senses are always there. They'll always remind you if you're willing to just drop in. Even consciousness can teach you about presence if you're willing to unbind identity from thought, if you're willing to unbind that subject from the objects of thought, and learn to rest in consciousness unbound, unqualified, not introducing will inside of consciousness. And by default and naturally, when we stop seeing things as they're not, we will finally see things as they are. And you may or may not have your questions answered, but you won't care. It's way better than having your questions answered. Because the questions we want answered are often of the thought realm. We want the questions answered because we believe we'll be in control if we have that knowledge or information. We're already 2 or 3 steps down the delusion path. Believing we're separate starts the process. The feeling of seeking underlies that because we're always looking for the missing piece, which doesn't exist. So we're functioning from a misconception already. And then the beliefs about control and imagination, time, distance, space, manipulating our environment. All these illusions are built on top of those other fundamental misconceptions. Then knowledge. Our identity gets so intertwined with thoughts and beliefs that we think the way out of it is to gain more knowledge or gather more knowledge. And it just isn't. Certainly for the first movement and the first shift. Now, reading or coming in contact with someone who's gone through this process can be very valuable, but it's not because of the knowledge. It's because of the way they point, pointing you back through the mind identification and the thoughts and beliefs, down through the identity structures, and then beyond the initial error that I am. Once you've moved beyond that, things start looking very different. There's nothing to do, and yet practice is wonderful. It's enjoyable, and it's spontaneous. The enjoyment of just being alive and experiencing is deep. It's uncaused. We don't need to find it. We don't need to find anything to be satisfied. It's beyond the categories of happy, sad, enjoyable, not enjoyable. The enjoyment of pure being and even undifferentiated being is beyond description. Someone asked me why I don't use the term magical. It is magical, but I explained to him that I am cautious to use too many descriptors like that because it's easy to get the seeking mind revved up with images of what that means. Because this isn't about images. It's not about getting somewhere. It's about clear seeing. Seeing what is and what is not. And being willing to fully accept that once it's seen and trust it. And let it digest and integrate through the body-mind. So reality shows you how to wake up to reality. It's staring you in the face at all times. Techniques can be helpful, inquiry and so forth. But those aren't really what wake you up. What wakes you up is awakeness. Awakeness wakes up to itself. And then the sense of you and what you are, you kind of lose interest in it. And then at some point it becomes clear how the identity structures and the sense of identity come about. And it's seen that they're completely erroneous. Identity itself does not exist. There's not separation, so there's not distinctness in such a way that an identity could arise or a self. This is profoundly enjoyable, but there's no one there to enjoy it. It's just enjoyment for its own sake. And it sounds like every sound in the room. And it feels like every sensation. And it looks like every form, every shape, every color. That's enlightenment. That's liberation.